On Christmas Eve of 1839, the riverfront town of Vicksburg, Mississippi prepared for celebrations that would never be forgotten, though not for the reasons anyone expected. 8 prominent merchants and plantation owners gathered at the Dalton estate for what promised to be the season's most extravagant feast. By midnight, 5 of them would be dead, their bodies convulsing on Persian rugs while candles flickered across scenes of unimaginable suffering. What the white families of Vicksburg initially dismissed as tragic misfortune would eventually expose a calculated act of resistance that had been years in the making, orchestrated by a woman whose name they barely knew, but whose hands had fed them for over a decade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The horror that unfolded in the Dalton dining room that December night was not the random cruelty of spoiled meat or accidental contamination. It was vengeance served on fine china, justice poured into crystal goblets, and liberation measured in carefully administered doses of oleander root. This is the story of how an enslaved cook named Judith became an executioner, how holiday cheer turned to Christmas horror, and how the peculiar institution of slavery created monsters on both sides of the serving table. Vicksburg in the late 1830s existed as a contradiction wrapped in cotton profits and religious proclamations. Perched on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, the town had transformed rapidly from frontier outpost to commercial powerhouse in less than 2 decades. The river brought everything: steamboats loaded with manufactured goods from the north, luxury items from Europe, and most profitably, human beings in chains from the upper south to be sold deeper into the cotton kingdom. The town's prosperity rested entirely on the backs of enslaved laborers who worked the surrounding plantations and staffed every significant household. By 1839, Warren County, where Vicksburg served as the seat, held more enslaved people than white residents, a demographic reality that haunted the dreams of even the most confident slaveholders. They lived in constant fear of uprising, of coordination among those they oppressed, of the day when sheer numbers might overwhelm the violence that kept the system functioning. The town itself reflected these anxieties in its architecture and layout. Grand homes lined the bluffs, built high to catch river breezes, but also to provide clear sight lines of approaching threats. Many featured widows' walks that served double duty for watching both riverboat traffic and any suspicious movement in the quarters below. The streets were patrolled regularly after dark by citizen watches, authorized to question any black person found without proper documentation. Church bells that called white families to worship on Sunday also served as alarm systems designed to summon armed men at the first sign of rebellion. Cotton was king, and Vicksburg was one of his provincial capitals. The town's warehouses bulged with compressed bales waiting for shipment downriver to New Orleans. Commission merchants grew wealthy, taking percentages from planters who needed credit to survive between harvests. Banks extended loans secured by human collateral, calculating the cash value of enslaved people with the same cold precision they applied to land and livestock. The entire economic ecosystem depended on forced labor, on buying and selling human beings, on the legal right to own another person's children and the fruits of their work in perpetuity. Yet, the white residents of Vicksburg saw themselves as civilized, as God-fearing Christians engaged in benevolent stewardship rather than systematic brutality. They built churches and formed literary societies. They hosted elaborate parties and subscribed to newspapers from New York and Charleston. They educated their daughters in French and piano, their sons in Latin and rhetoric. They convinced themselves that they were bringing civilization to a wilderness and Christianity to heathens, that their wealth reflected divine favor rather than stolen labor. Into this world of calculated cruelty disguised as gentility came the Dalton family in 1827. Marcus Dalton arrived in Vicksburg with moderate capital, considerable ambition, and an instinct for opportunity that would make him one of the region's most wealthy men within a decade. He was not a planter in the traditional sense, but rather a merchant who dealt in cotton, credit, and human flesh. His fortune came from facilitating the trade that kept the plantation system functioning, from extending loans to cash-poor planters, from buying cotton futures, and most lucratively, from operating a slave trading firm that brought hundreds of people in chains through Vicksburg's auction blocks. Marcus was a man of medium height, with thinning brown hair and pale blue eyes that revealed nothing of his thoughts. He dressed with understated elegance, favoring dark suits that conveyed respectability rather than flash. His manner was courteous without warmth, efficient without cruelty, at least in public. He calculated every interaction for potential profit, every relationship for strategic advantage. Those who knew him well understood that Marcus Dalton never acted from impulse or emotion, only from carefully measured self-interest. Eleanor Dalton came from an established Virginia family that had fallen on difficult times. She brought little money to the marriage but considerable social credentials that Marcus needed to ascend beyond mere wealth into genuine respectability. Eleanor was a handsome rather than beautiful woman, tall and thin with auburn hair that she wore in elaborate styles that required hours of effort from her lady's maid. She had a nervous disposition that manifested in constant activity, in planning elaborate social events, in managing every detail of household operations, in maintaining the facade of genteel perfection that her position required. The Daltons had 3 children that survived infancy. Thomas, the eldest son, was being groomed to inherit his father's business empire. At 19 in 1839, he possessed his father's calculating nature but lacked the discipline that kept Marcus's cruelty within socially acceptable bounds. Margaret, 16, had inherited her mother's anxious temperament and spent most of her time preparing for the advantageous marriage that would cement another business alliance. The youngest, Robert, was only 12 and still occupied the ambiguous space of childhood, too young for serious business training but old enough to absorb the casual brutality that surrounded him. The Dalton mansion stood on Cherry Street, one of Vicksburg's most prestigious addresses. Was a Greek Revival structure of considerable size, with massive white columns supporting a second-story gallery that overlooked formal gardens descending toward the river. The interior featured imported wallpaper from France, furniture crafted in New Orleans, and carpets shipped from Turkey. Crystal chandeliers illuminated rooms where business deals worth thousands of dollars were negotiated over brandy and cigars. Everything about the house communicated success, permanence, and the kind of wealth that expected to endure for generations. Behind the main house stood the kitchen, a separate brick building positioned far enough away to keep cooking heat and fire risk distant from the family's living quarters. This arrangement also created a physical barrier between the enslaved people who prepared food and the family they served, a boundary that reinforced the social distance even as it required constant traffic between the two structures. Connected by a covered walkway, the kitchen building also housed a small room where Judith slept, a space barely large enough for a narrow bed and a trunk containing her few possessions. Judith had come into the Dalton household in 1828, purchased at auction when she was approximately 20 years old. Her age was uncertain because enslaved people's births were rarely recorded with precision, and Judith herself could only estimate based on fragmentary memories from childhood.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She had been born somewhere in the Carolinas or possibly Georgia on a rice plantation where she learned to cook under her mother's instruction. Her mother's name had been Ruth, and her father was a man named Isaac who worked as a carpenter and had been sold away when Judith was perhaps 7 or 8 years old. She never saw him again. Judith's early life followed the brutal pattern common to enslaved people in the Lower South. She was separated from her mother at 14 when her first owner died and the estate was divided among his heirs. She was sold twice more before Marcus Dalton purchased her in New Orleans, where she had been sent by a planter who needed cash more urgently than he needed another cook. The bill of sale described her as a healthy Negro woman, skilled in cooking and baking, with no physical defects or troublesome tendencies. She cost Marcus $1,100, a significant investment that reflected both the value of her skills and the inflated prices that characterized the internal slave trade in the late 1820s. At the time of the Christmas dinner in 1839, Judith was approximately 31 years old. though she looked both younger and older depending on the light and her expression. Years of standing over hot fires had marked her skin with burn scars along her forearms. Her hands were rough from constant work, from kneading bread and plucking chickens and scrubbing cast iron. She wore her hair wrapped in cloth in the style common among enslaved women who worked indoors, practical and neat, but offering no hint of vanity or personal expression. Her face had strong features that revealed nothing unless she chose to reveal it, an inscrutability that white people often mistook for simple-mindedness, but that actually concealed a keen intelligence that observed everything and forgot nothing. Judith's position as cook placed her in an unusual category within the plantation hierarchy. She was neither a field hand subject to the gang labor system, nor exactly a house servant who worked in constant proximity to the white family. Her work was skilled and essential, requiring knowledge that took years to acquire and that made her difficult to replace. A good cook was a valuable asset, and Marcus Dalton knew it. He had paid premium price for Judith specifically because his wife's social ambitions required elaborate entertaining, and Eleanor lacked both the skill and temperament to manage food preparation herself. The kitchen was Judith's domain, in ways that few spaces on the plantation were anyone's domain except the owner. She controlled the schedule of meal preparation, the inventory of supplies, the training of younger enslaved people who assisted her. When she worked, white family members rarely entered the kitchen building, preferring to communicate their requirements through Eleanor or through notes listing specific dishes desired. This created a space where Judith could think her own thoughts, could remember her mother's songs, could plan actions that would have been impossible under constant surveillance. Over 11 years in the Dalton household, Judith had learned to read the rhythms of the family with precision born of survival necessity. She knew when Marcus was in a dangerous mood by the sound of his footsteps on the gallery. She understood which business associates required special attention and which could be served adequately without extraordinary effort. She had learned to anticipate Eleanor's anxious demands before they were spoken, a skill that made her simultaneously indispensable and invisible in the way that white families preferred their servants to be. But Judith was not simply a passive observer of the white world that claimed to own her. She maintained connections to an underground network of enslaved people throughout Vicksburg and the surrounding plantations, communication channels that existed beneath the surface of white awareness. Information traveled through this network with remarkable speed, carried by hired-out laborers who moved between properties, by washerwomen who gathered at common wells, by boatmen who worked the river docks. Through these channels, Judith learned things that Marcus Dalton would have paid dearly to know if he had been capable of imagining that enslaved people possessed their own information systems. She knew which overseers were particularly brutal, which plantations had recently purchased people from her home region, which white men made secret visits to the quarters under cover of darkness. She knew about escape attempts before white authorities learned of them, about conflicts within white families that created opportunities or dangers, about which enslaved people could be trusted and which were too broken or too compromised to risk confiding in. This knowledge was power, limited and dangerous power, but power nonetheless, in a world designed to render her powerless. The peculiar intimacy forced upon enslaved domestic workers created a strange paradox that white families never seemed to recognize. They wanted their servants close enough to anticipate every need, yet distant enough to remain invisible. They demanded loyalty and discretion, while denying the basic humanity that might inspire such feelings genuinely. They expected gratitude for not inflicting the worst possible cruelties while never questioning the fundamental violence of owning another human being. This cognitive dissonance created blind spots that people like Judith often turned to advantage.
Learned to exploit for survival, and occasionally for something more dangerous than mere survival. Eleanor Dalton believed she understood Judith, believed she had cultivated a relationship of mutual respect, if not quite equality. She would sometimes sit in the kitchen while Judith worked, talking about household concerns or complaints about other enslaved people who failed to meet her exacting standards. She convinced herself that these conversations represented a kind of friendship, that Judith valued her confidence and appreciated being included in household decisions. Eleanor never seemed to notice that Judith rarely spoke unless asked a direct question, never volunteered opinions or observations, maintained always the careful neutrality that was the only safe position for an enslaved person in close proximity to white power. What Eleanor interpreted as contentment was actually the carefully maintained performance that enabled Judith to survive day after day in a situation offering no escape. Judith had learned long ago that resistance could take many forms, that not all defiance announced itself with dramatic gestures. Sometimes resistance meant maintaining a private self that the white family could never touch, no matter how thoroughly they believed they owned her body and her labor. Sometimes it meant holding on to memories they could not steal, connections they could not sever, thoughts they could not police. And sometimes, when circumstances aligned and opportunities emerged, resistance meant acting on possibilities that had been taking shape in darkness for longer than anyone would have guessed. The other enslaved people in the Dalton household occupied various positions in the complicated hierarchy that existed among those who shared bondage but not always solidarity. There was Samuel, a man in his 40s who worked as Marcus's personal servant, accompanying him on business trips and managing his wardrobe with meticulous attention. Samuel had learned that his best chance for tolerable existence lay in absolute reliability, in making himself indispensable through competence rather than personality. He spoke rarely, observed constantly, and had survived through careful political neutrality that made him safe to be around, but impossible to truly know. Rachel served as Eleanor's lady's maid, a position that required her to be available at all hours for the endless demands of maintaining a white woman's appearance and wardrobe. She was younger than Judith, perhaps 25, and had been born on a plantation in Louisiana before being sold east to Mississippi. Rachel moved through the house like a shadow, present when needed and invisible otherwise, her face a careful blank that revealed nothing of her thoughts about the family she served. She and Judith maintained cordial relations, but not intimacy, both understanding that closeness could become liability if either one was ever questioned about the other's activities or opinions. Two teenage boys, James and Peter, handled heavy work around the property, chopping wood, carrying water, maintaining the gardens, and performing the endless physical labor that kept a substantial household functioning. They were brothers, purchased together 3 years earlier when their previous owner died, and Marcus had calculated that keeping family units intact made financial sense because it reduced the risk of escape attempts or depression that might diminish their work capacity. The boys slept in a small outbuilding near the stables and had limited interaction with the house servants, though James sometimes helped Judith carry large pots or heavy bags of flour that required more strength than she possessed. Old Moses, who was probably in his 60s, though no one knew for certain, served as a general laborer who performed tasks requiring experience rather than physical strength. He had been with the Daltons since 1827, purchased as part of Marcus's initial household establishment, and had seen numerous other enslaved people come and go through sale or death. Moses rarely spoke about the past, but Judith had learned over time that he had once lived in Virginia and that he had lost a wife and 3 children to the domestic slave trade decades earlier. His eyes held a sadness that went beyond the immediate circumstances of bondage, the accumulated weight of losses that could never be recovered or even properly mourned. The interaction among these people who shared enslavement but little else created complicated dynamics that white families rarely understood or even noticed. There were alliances and antagonisms, shared confidences and careful distances, moments of solidarity and instances of betrayal. The Daltons viewed their enslaved workers as individuals only in terms of skill and reliability, never imagining the complex social world that existed in the quarters, in the kitchen, in the stolen moments when white surveillance briefly relaxed. Judith occupied a unique position in this internal hierarchy because her skills gave her a degree of autonomy that others lacked. She controlled resources, the food stores and cooking implements that were essential to household functioning. She possessed knowledge that was difficult to replace, recipes and techniques that had been passed down through generations and that could not be easily taught to someone new. This gave her leverage that she used carefully, never obviously, always maintaining the appearance of absolute compliance while actually exercising more control over her immediate circumstances than the Daltons realized. The kitchen itself reflected this hidden autonomy. While it contained equipment that belonged to Marcus Dalton, purchased with his money and legally his property, the space operated according to Judith's organization and schedule. She knew where every pot hung, every spice jar sat, every knife was sharpened and stored. She controlled the rhythm of food preparation, the timing of meals, the coordination of multiple dishes that had to reach the table at precisely the right temperature and moment. Eleanor might request a particular menu, but Judith decided how to execute that menu, which ingredients to use, what techniques to employ, how to solve problems that inevitably arose during complex meal preparation. This degree of control would become crucial as Judith began to plan something that went beyond the everyday forms of resistance that characterized her life. She had been thinking about possibilities for months before the Christmas dinner that would change everything. The thoughts had started small, almost idle fantasies during long hours standing over hot stoves. What if certain ingredients were confused with others that looked similar but carried different properties? What if careful measurements were miscalculated in ways that might prove unfortunate for those who consumed the results? What if the knowledge of plants and roots that had been passed down through generations, knowledge that white people dismissed as superstition or folk medicine, could be applied toward purposes they had never imagined? These thoughts remained abstract until the autumn of 1839, when specific circumstances began to transform vague possibilities into concrete planning. The catalyst was not a single dramatic event, but rather an accumulation of incidents that finally exceeded Judith's capacity to continue performing compliance without action. In September, Marcus had sold away Rachel's younger sister to a plantation in Louisiana, separating the young woman from the only family she had left, without warning or explanation beyond his need for ready cash to cover a business debt. Rachel had wept quietly in the kitchen afterward, and Judith had witnessed the casual cruelty of a transaction that meant nothing to Marcus, but everything to the woman whose family he had just destroyed for his financial convenience. In October, Thomas Dalton had begun making advances toward a young woman named Clara, who worked in a neighboring household. His attentions were not romantic but predatory, the assumption of sexual access that young white men of his class believed they possessed over enslaved women. Clara had confided in Judith during a chance meeting at the market, explaining that she feared both compliance and resistance, knowing that either choice led to suffering. Judith had offered what comfort she could, but the situation represented a familiar pattern of violence that white society not only permitted but effectively encouraged through its absolute refusal to recognize enslaved people's right to bodily autonomy. In November, Marcus had entered into a business partnership that Judith learned about through Samuel, who had overheard conversations during a trip to Natchez. The partnership involved purchasing a large number of enslaved people from Virginia and Kentucky to be resold deeper into the Cotton Kingdom, a profitable speculation that would destroy dozens of families for Marcus's financial gain. Samuel had mentioned this almost casually, as if such ventures were too common to merit particular notice. But Judith had felt something shift inside her when she heard the details. How many mothers would lose children? How many families would be scattered across states, never to see each other again? And all so that men like Marcus Dalton could add a few more thousands to fortunes already more substantial than they could spend in lifetimes. These incidents individually might have been absorbed into the general weight of horror that characterized life in bondage. But their accumulation during those autumn months created something different, a clarity about the fundamental evil of the system and about her own unwillingness to continue enabling it through complicity. Judith understood that she could not overthrow slavery itself, could not free herself or others through individual action, but she could perhaps strike at some of those who most profited from the system, could make them pay at least some small price for the immeasurable suffering they caused daily without thought or remorse. The decision to act came gradually rather than in a single moment of resolution. Judith found herself evaluating possibilities with the same careful attention she applied to developing new recipes or solving problems with difficult ingredients. What resources did she have access to? What knowledge did she possess that others lacked? What opportunities might present themselves? How could she act in ways that would accomplish something meaningful while minimizing risk to herself and others who might be suspected if her actions were discovered? The Christmas dinner emerged as the obvious opportunity almost immediately. Eleanor had been planning an elaborate holiday celebration since early November, envisioning an event that would demonstrate the Dalton family's prosperity and social prominence. She had drawn up guest lists, revised them multiple times, and finally settled on inviting 8 families who represented Vicksburg's commercial and planting elite. These were men who controlled thousands of acres and hundreds of human beings, men whose fortunes had been built on stolen labor and the domestic slave trade, men who never questioned their right to own other people or to profit from separating families and working human beings to early deaths. The guest list read like a catalog of Vicksburg's most successful exploiters. There would be Henry Patterson, who owned 3 plantations totaling over 2,000 acres and more than 150 enslaved workers. Patterson had a reputation for particular cruelty toward anyone who failed to meet his production quotas, and enslaved people spoke his name with fear throughout the region. William Foster was a commission merchant who had partnered with Marcus in several slave trading ventures, a man who calculated human value in dollars and cents and who maintained a private jail where newly purchased people were held before being shipped downriver to deeper markets. Charles Bennett operated the largest cotton press in Vicksburg, where enslaved laborers worked under conditions so dangerous that serious injuries were common and deaths not unusual. Bennett's facility processed hundreds of thousands of bales annually, each one representing the stolen labor of people working from sunup to sundown in fields where overseers enforced discipline with whips and worse. George Morrison was a banker who held mortgages on numerous plantations and who regularly foreclosed on failing operations, seizing both land and the human beings who had been used as collateral without any consideration for the families he was destroying through these transactions. James Whittemore owned the hotel where slave traders conducted their business, providing accommodations for men who traveled the South, buying human beings in one location to sell them at profit elsewhere. Whittemore had grown wealthy facilitating this traffic in human flesh, providing a respectable veneer for transactions that were morally indistinguishable from kidnapping and extortion. Robert Hayes was an attorney who specialized in defending slave owners sued for cruelty or wrongful death, arguing in court that property owners had absolute rights over their property and that no outside authority could question their treatment of human beings they held in bondage. These men and their wives would gather at the Dalton mansion on Christmas Eve to celebrate another year of prosperity built on systematic oppression and routine violence. They would eat food prepared by hands that belonged to a woman they would never see as fully human. They would toast their success with wine served by people whose labor enriched them while they remained trapped in poverty by legal design.
They would discuss business ventures and social gossip while being waited on by individuals whose own families had been destroyed by the economic system these men controlled and defended. The contradiction never seemed to register with them, or if it did, they had developed justifications and rationalizations so complete that they could maintain clear consciences while participating in ongoing atrocities. Judith observed Eleanor's planning sessions with careful attention, noting which dishes were being requested, which ingredients would need to be ordered from suppliers, what the schedule of preparation would require in the days before the dinner. She offered suggestions when asked, maintained neutral efficiency when assigned tasks, and never revealed that she was simultaneously planning something that would transform Eleanor's anticipated triumph into a horror that would haunt Vicksburg for generations. The technical challenge was substantial, but not impossible. Judith needed something that would produce dramatic symptoms relatively quickly,
that would affect multiple people simultaneously, that would be difficult to detect in food where strong flavors might mask unfamiliar tastes, and that she could obtain without arousing suspicion. She also needed to ensure that the mechanism would point toward accidental contamination rather than deliberate poisoning, creating plausible deniability that might protect her, at least temporarily, from immediate retaliation. Her knowledge of plants and their properties came from her mother Ruth, who had learned from her own mother, in a chain of knowledge transmission that stretched back generations. This was not the formal botanical science that white physicians studied in medical schools, but rather practical knowledge accumulated through experience and passed down orally through communities who had no access to written medical texts. White people often dismissed this knowledge as superstition or primitive folk medicine, never imagining that it represented a sophisticated understanding of the natural world, developed over centuries by people who had learned to work with available resources despite systematic exclusion from formal education. Judith knew which plants could reduce fever and which could cause it. She knew which roots helped with digestion and which disrupted it violently. She knew which leaves made healing teas and which produced symptoms that resembled severe illness. This knowledge had been intended to help people survive, to provide remedies when white doctors either refused to treat enslaved people or charged fees that made their services impossible to access. But the same knowledge could be inverted, applied toward harm rather than healing if circumstances warranted such application. Oleander grew throughout Vicksburg, planted as ornamental shrubs in gardens where their attractive flowers and evergreen foliage provided year-round visual interest. White families valued them for their beauty and hardiness, never fully appreciating how toxic every part of the plant actually was. The roots, leaves, flowers, and stems all contained cardiac glycosides that could cause severe gastrointestinal distress, irregular heartbeat, and, in sufficient doses, death. The symptoms resembled severe food poisoning initially, which would provide cover for the true cause until examination revealed the specific nature of the toxin. Judith had access to oleander from the Dalton garden, where several large bushes grew along the property boundary. She could harvest roots without anyone noticing their absence, could dry and grind them into powder that would be virtually impossible to distinguish from the many legitimate spices and herbs used in ordinary cooking. The timing would require precision because oleander's effects manifested within hours rather than days, but this actually worked to her advantage by concentrating suspicion on the most recent meal rather than foods consumed over longer periods. The technical preparation began in early December, nearly 3 weeks before the planned dinner. Judith carefully extracted oleander roots during early morning hours when the household still slept, working by lantern light to obtain material that she then dried over the course of several days using the low heat of the kitchen fire at night. She ground the dried roots using a mortar and pestle until they became fine powder, indistinguishable in appearance from the ground herbs and spices used in ordinary cooking. She stored this powder in an unmarked container, kept among other similar containers on the kitchen's highest shelf, accessible only to her and appearing to be nothing more than another cooking ingredient. The planning went beyond simple logistics to include psychological preparation for what Judith was contemplating. She was not a casual killer, not someone who could take lives without moral consideration, but she had reached a point where the daily complicity of feeding and serving people who profited from systematic oppression felt more morally unbearable than the thought of ending some of those lives. Every meal she prepared sustained the energy of people who used that energy to inflict suffering on others. Every dinner she served helped maintain the social relationships among people who collaborated in the ongoing destruction of families and communities. Her skilled labor contributed directly to the continuation of a system that was itself mass murder, distributed across time and space, made invisible through legal sanction and social acceptance. Judith thought about her mother Ruth, dead now for years from causes that had never been properly diagnosed or treated because enslaved people's health mattered only insofar as it affected their work capacity. She thought about her father Isaac, sold away when she was a child and probably dead by now, his entire life consumed in labor that enriched strangers who never knew his name. She thought about the countless people she had known who had suffered and died to create the wealth that men like Marcus Dalton and Henry Patterson and William Foster enjoyed without even questioning their right to profit from others' destruction. If her action saved no one, if it freed no one, if it changed nothing about the fundamental structure of the system, at least it would be something other than complicity. At least some of those who profited most directly from slavery would pay some price for their choices. At least their Christmas celebration would be interrupted by suffering of the sort they inflicted routinely on others. The moral calculus was complicated, and Judith did not pretend to have achieved perfect clarity about the ethics of what she was planning. But she had achieved certainty about her unwillingness to continue performing submission without resistance, to continue enabling the comfort of people whose comfort depended on her bondage and the bondage of millions like her. The week before Christmas brought a flurry of activity to the Dalton household that made Judith's final preparations easier rather than harder. Eleanor was in a state of constant agitation, supervising decorations, checking linens, ordering servants about with increasingly frantic instructions. The chaos created cover for Judith's movements, as no one paid close attention to what the cook was doing in the kitchen when there were parlor arrangements to fret over and silver to polish until it gleamed. Marcus had his own preoccupations during this period, involved in complex business negotiations that required his attention during the day and kept him occupied with correspondence and calculations in his study during the evenings. The slave trading venture he had partnered on was approaching a critical stage, with a shipment of nearly 40 people expected to arrive from Alexandria, Virginia in early January. These people, purchased in the Upper South, where the soil was exhausted and enslaved labor had become more valuable as export commodity than as agricultural workers, would be sold at substantial profit to plantation owners in Mississippi and Louisiana, who needed fresh workers to replace those who had died or been worked to incapacity. Marcus stood to make several $1,000s from this single transaction, money that came at the cost of 40 families destroyed, 40 lives disrupted, 40 human beings treated as fungible units in a commercial exchange. Thomas Dalton had been tasked with managing some of the logistical details of this venture, which gave him an inflated sense of his own importance and made him even more insufferable than usual around the household. He strutted through the house giving orders to servants, critiquing their work with the casual cruelty that came naturally to young men raised to believe that certain human beings existed only to serve their convenience. He had continued his pursuit of Clara despite her obvious discomfort, and Judith had heard through the information network that the young woman was considering running away, even though she knew the odds of successful escape were minimal and the consequences of capture would be severe. The guest list for the Christmas dinner had remained stable through Eleanor's various revisions, settling finally on the 8 families whose presence would represent both the Daltons' current social position and their aspirations for even greater prominence. In addition to the men Judith had already cataloged in her mind, there would be their wives, women who performed their own rules in maintaining the system even if they did not directly buy and sell human beings. These women managed households run by enslaved labor, accepted the profits generated by their husbands' businesses without questioning the source, and raised children to believe that owning other people was natural and righteous rather than obscene and criminal. Among the wives scheduled to attend, several stood out for reasons that made Judith's planned action feel even more justified, despite its extremity. Catherine Patterson, Henry's wife, was known for particular cruelty toward the young women who served in her household, using physical punishment for the smallest infractions and creating an atmosphere of terror that made her personal servants the objects of pity even among others who shared bondage. Elizabeth Foster, William's wife, participated actively in her husband's slave trading ventures, accompanying him to auctions where she would inspect enslaved women with the cold calculation of someone evaluating livestock, paying particular attention to childbearing capacity and physical attractiveness that might increase resale value. Margaret Bennet, Charles's wife, had developed a reputation for religious hypocrisy that was remarkable, even in a society where Christianity and slaveholding coexisted without apparent cognitive dissonance. She led Bible study groups for white women where they discussed their Christian duty to care for their slaves' spiritual welfare, while never questioning the fundamental evil of holding them in bondage in the first place. She spoke frequently about how slavery was part of God's plan for civilizing Africans and bringing them to Christianity, as if spiritual instruction justified lifetime captivity and the separation of families. The men and women who would gather at the Dalton table on Christmas Eve represented the best society that Vicksburg had to offer by the standards of their own community. The most successful, most respectable, most prominent citizens. They attended church services where ministers preached that slavery was biblically sanctioned. They hosted gatherings where they discussed literature and politics while being served by people whose literacy was illegal and whose political voices were completely suppressed. They raised children to perpetuate the system, passing down wealth and prejudices in equal measure. They saw themselves as civilized people engaged in legitimate enterprise, rather than as participants in an ongoing crime against humanity. Judith's preparations during the final week involved not only the technical aspects of what she planned to do, but also careful observation of household patterns to identify potential complications. She needed to understand exactly who would be present during food preparation, when she would have privacy in the kitchen, how serving would be managed during the dinner itself, and what the aftermath might look like. Eleanor had decided that Judith would prepare the food, but that Samuel and Rachel would handle the actual serving, which meant that Judith would not be in the dining room when the poisoning took effect. This was both advantage and disadvantage, removing her from the immediate scene, but also leaving her without direct knowledge of how events were unfolding. The menu that Eleanor had finally settled on after weeks of deliberation was elaborate, even by the standards of wealthy households accustomed to excess. The dinner would begin with oyster soup, followed by roasted turkey, baked ham, venison in wine sauce, and a fish course featuring redfish from the Gulf. There would be multiple vegetable preparations: sweet potatoes glazed with molasses, green beans with bacon, creamed corn, and baked squash. Breads would include both wheat and cornbread varieties, and there would be several desserts including plum pudding, mince pies, and a special cake that Eleanor had requested specifically. The entire meal represented hours of labor and the coordination of multiple cooking processes that had to reach completion at precisely coordinated times. Judith had decided that the venison course offered the best opportunity for introducing the oleander powder. The strong flavor of the wine sauce would mask any slight bitterness that might otherwise be detected, and the richness of the dish meant that it would be consumed by all guests rather than being optional like some of the side dishes.
Preparations. She would prepare 2 separate pots of the sauce, one for the family and guests that would contain the poison, and one for the servants who would eat later from leftovers, assuming anyone survived to eat anything after the dinner concluded. The quantity of oleander required careful calculation. Too little might produce only mild symptoms that would be dismissed as temporary digestive upset. Too much might act so quickly that suspicion would immediately fall on the food and potentially on Judith herself before she could establish any distance from the events. She needed something that would take perhaps an hour or two to manifest fully, long enough for the meal to conclude and for guests to have dispersed to other parts of the house, but not so long that people would return home before symptoms became apparent.
The powder she had prepared represented several weeks of work, and she estimated that she had enough to create lethal doses for 8 to 10 people if distributed properly through the wine sauce. On December 23rd, the day before the planned dinner, Judith moved through her preparations with the calm focus that characterized all her best work. She had spent the morning preparing stocks and early stages of various dishes, working alongside James, who had been assigned to help with heavy lifting and basic food preparation. The boy was perhaps 16, quiet and observant, and Judith found herself wondering what kind of man he would become if he survived long enough to reach adulthood in a system designed to break people long before they reached natural old age. She sent James away in the early afternoon with instructions to chop more firewood and to inform Eleanor that the food preparation was proceeding on schedule. Once alone, Judith retrieved the container of oleander powder from its storage location and held it in her hands for several minutes, feeling the weight of what it represented. This was the moment where theoretical planning became concrete action, where thoughts of resistance transformed into actual implementation. She had created multiple opportunities to change her mind, to step back from the edge, to find some other way of dealing with the moral impossibility of her situation. But each time she considered abandoning the plan, she thought about all the people who had suffered and died to create the comfort that the Dalton family and their guests enjoyed, and the resolve returned stronger than before. The wine sauce for the venison required several steps that Judith had perfected over years of cooking elaborate meals for the Dalton family and their associates. She started with a reduction of red wine combined with beef stock, onions, herbs, and spices that would concentrate flavors while the liquid volume decreased through evaporation. This base would later be enriched with butter and flour to create the proper consistency, with the final adjustments made just before serving to ensure optimal temperature and texture. It was during the early stages of this reduction, while the liquid was still quite thin and the flavors not yet fully developed, that Judith added the oleander powder to one of the 2 pots she had prepared. She used a wooden spoon to stir the powder into the wine and stock, watching it dissolve completely into the dark liquid where it became invisible and undetectable except through chemical analysis that no one would think to perform unless they already suspected poisoning. The amount she added represented months of careful thought about dosing, based on fragmentary knowledge passed down through generations, combined with her own observations about which quantities of various plant materials produced which effects. She was not conducting a scientific experiment with controlled variables and precise measurements. She was applying knowledge accumulated through oral tradition and necessity, hoping that her calculations would prove accurate enough to accomplish her purpose without revealing her agency too quickly. The second pot of wine sauce, intended for servants and any family members who might survive to eat leftovers, contained no oleander. Judith marked this pot with a small chip on the rim that only she would recognize, a detail that would allow her to identify the safe version if she needed to demonstrate which food was responsible for the poisoning. Her plan included the possibility that she might need to taste both sauces in front of investigators, and she needed to ensure she could identify the safe version by touch even if she could not see the mark clearly. As the afternoon progressed into evening, Judith completed other preparation tasks that would allow her to finish cooking efficiently the next day. She prepared the oyster soup base, cleaned and seasoned the turkey, created the filling for the mince pies, and organized ingredients and equipment so that everything would be ready for the final cooking stages. Eleanor visited the kitchen 3 times during this period to check on progress and to modify minor details of the menu, each time expressing anxiety about whether everything would be perfect for their important guests. Judith assured her with the calm competence that Eleanor had come to depend on, never revealing that she was simultaneously planning to transform Eleanor's anticipated social triumph into a scene of horror that would haunt the household forever. That night, sleeping in her small room adjacent to the kitchen, Judith experienced emotions that were complex beyond simple description. She felt fear about the risks she was taking, about the possibility of discovery and the brutal consequences that would follow. She felt anticipation about finally acting rather than merely enduring, about striking back in some meaningful way against people who had never faced consequences for the suffering they caused. She felt sorrow for lives that would be lost, even though those lives belonged to people who participated actively in the destruction of countless others. She felt doubt about whether her action was justified, whether individual violence could be moral when directed against systematic violence, whether she had the right to make decisions that would affect others beyond herself. But underneath all these conflicting emotions lay a deeper certainty that had been building for months and that now felt unshakable. She could not continue to participate in her own oppression and the oppression of millions through passive compliance. She could not continue to use her skills to feed and serve people whose wealth depended on crimes against humanity. She could not continue to pretend that the relationships between enslaved and enslaver could ever be anything other than fundamentally violent, irrespective of how much individual kindness or cruelty characterized specific interactions. The system itself was the crime, and everyone who benefited from it bore responsibility regardless of whether they acknowledged its entirety or not.
Of whether they personally wielded whips or merely enjoyed the comfort created by those who did. Christmas Eve morning arrived with cold temperatures unusual for Mississippi but appropriate for the season. The sky was gray with clouds that threatened rain but had not yet delivered, and the air held a dampness that penetrated clothing and made the kitchen fire even more welcome than usual. Judith arrived in the kitchen before dawn to begin the final preparations, working by lamplight until the sun rose enough to provide natural illumination through the windows. The turkey went into the oven first, a massive bird that would require hours of slow roasting to reach proper tenderness while maintaining moisture. Judith basted it regularly with butter and pan drippings, monitoring the color of the skin and the internal temperature through techniques she had learned from her mother decades earlier. The ham had been cured and smoked weeks before, and now required only final baking with a glaze of brown sugar and spices. The redfish arrived fresh from the market that morning, delivered by a vendor who supplied several wealthy households with seafood transported on ice from the coast. Prepared and would need only brief final cooking to be ready for service. The vegetables were cooked or prepared for last-minute finishing. The breads were baked and keeping warm. The desserts were complete and arranged on the sideboard in the dining room, and the 2 pots of wine sauce sat side by side on the kitchen work table, identical in appearance except for the small chip on the rim of one that marked it as the safe version. Guests began arriving shortly before 7 in the evening, their carriages pulling up to the front entrance where Samuel greeted them and directed enslaved workers from their own households to appropriate waiting areas. The guests themselves ascended the steps to the gallery where Marcus and Eleanor received them with the practiced grace of experienced hosts. There were the usual exclamations about the cold weather, compliments about the house decorations, and the social pleasantries that preceded any formal dinner among people of their class. Judith could hear the murmur of voices from the parlor where guests gathered before dinner, the sound of masculine laughter and feminine conversation, the clink of glasses as pre-dinner drinks were served. She recognized some of the voices from previous events and identified specific guests by their speech patterns and the particular timbre of their laughter. Henry Patterson had a booming voice that carried through walls, while William Foster spoke more quietly, but with an intensity that made his words audible even at a distance. The women's voices blended together more, following social scripts about weather and health and children that varied little from one gathering to the next. At 7:30, Eleanor appeared in the kitchen doorway to announce that dinner would be served in 15 minutes. Judith acknowledged the instruction and began the final coordination that would bring all elements of the meal together at the proper moment. She signaled to Samuel and Rachel that they should prepare to begin service, confirmed that the serving dishes were properly heated, and made final adjustments to ensure that everything would reach the table at optimal temperature and appearance. The dining room had been transformed for the occasion into a scene of carefully orchestrated elegance. The long mahogany table gleamed with polish, reflecting the light from candelabras placed at intervals along its length. The best china had been brought out from storage where it lived between important occasions, white porcelain with delicate gold trim that had been imported from England at considerable expense. Crystal glasses stood ready for water, wine, and after-dinner cordials. Linen napkins, monogrammed with the Dalton family initial, were folded at each place setting. The whole scene represented exactly the kind of refined luxury that Eleanor had been striving to create, a table worthy of the guests they had invited and reflective of their own social position. The guests took their assigned seats according to Eleanor's carefully planned arrangement, which placed the most important men near Marcus at the head of the table and their wives in positions that reflected their social standing. Conversation continued as they settled, comfortable discussion among people who knew each other well and who shared common interests and values. They spoke about cotton prices and railroad development, about political news from Washington and social gossip from Vicksburg. No one mentioned slavery except in passing references to labor management or property values, treating the foundation of their entire world as simply part of the natural order, rather than as the moral catastrophe it actually represented. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.